morning sun flying high in the sky till the day is done. I can't break away. Like a child in his fantasy, punching holes in the walls of reality. All my life I wanted to fly, but I don't have the wings, and I wonder why I can't break away. Oh, well, Mama told me when I was young, stand tall, girl, you're number one. But you can be what you wanna be, but you can't change the course of your destiny. I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. Ooh, I can't break away.
Greetings, my excellent friend.
Good evening. Welcome in. First, that absolute banger of a song that I played in the pre-intro is called Food for Worms. It's by a band that doesn't exist anymore called Sister Sin. The lead singer went solo. But it's an awesome song, and a lot of the context of it was kind of relevant for tonight, so just went with it. I wonder if it ever bothered Saint-Just to be the mouthpiece. I don't think he thought of himself as just the mouthpiece. Richie Cranium coming in with 11 viewers on the raid. I was just sitting at Richie's channel. He was playing Minecraft. Thank you very much, my friend, as well as CF with the host, Gilly with the host, and Rocket with the host. So tonight is episode 30. We started this journey in late May, early June of last year, and we are at the 30th episode. And to be quite honest, within 2 episodes of Act 1 of the French Revolution coming to a close. 30 episodes. Yeah, I did some math on this. It's about 90 hours spoken after tonight. I will have spoken for 90 hours on the French Revolution. I have over 350 pages of notes written at episode 30. That's a lot. That's an outline. That's 350 pages of
The only escape
outline.
from the past is to bury it.
Richie, I get it. Streamer, post-stream, go get your food and stretch your legs and all that stuff. But yeah, 350 pages written is a lot. I thought about this whole thing in the context of writing a book recently, and I'm like, 350 pages is a book. I have written a personal book so far, and I still have...
My lord!
I still have a solid 15-ish episodes to write, which will add an additional 11 to 14 pages to that total per episode. So, yeah, we got a lot more to go. But 30, when we hit these 10 markers, it's always kind of take a moment, right? Think about how far we've gone. I actually refer to one specific episode that we have done in the past for a reference tonight, just to give you a feel for how long ago that was. But last week, we watched the French Revolution devour some of her most famous children. We saw none other than Georges Danton go down to the guillotine, along with Camille Desmoulins, after the Ultras faction was effectively eradicated, with Jacques Hébert and all of the de-Christianizers going down. And they were all gobbled up at the instruction of the revolution's friends on the Committee of Public Safety, who have been consolidating their grip on power and then trimming the fat on both the left and the right of the political pure center that the committee occupied under this guiding hand of Maximilien Robespierre. And tonight's going to kind of be the, if not the grand finale for, it will certainly be the build-up to that for Mr. Robespierre. But according to him, the factional partisanship that the ultras versus the indulgents represented, threatened to lead France to a place off of this narrow path of virtue, which only Robespierre can define and only he can see. And we've talked about effectively that this thing is narrowing to like a tightrope for him, where he is increasingly chopping at his enemies on both sides, to where what actually exists is a very, very thin band. Duke Whiskey, can we shout out my friend Duke Whiskey, please? He is a gentleman from the UK who streams during the day. He's got some CK3 in there. He does some amazing stuff with his community. He's very kind, a lot of fun. If you wouldn't mind, it's not possible for me to ever drop in there and raid him due to the timings of our schedules. But if you could maybe see fit to give him a follow, I would appreciate it. He's a genuinely good person. Welcome in, Dukes. Good to see you. But again, we're on this ever-increasingly narrow band for Robespierre because he keeps trimming at the edges, right? He just keeps taking a razor blade now to the edge of both sides, making this path he's on and the allies he has on it smaller and smaller. But in more practical terms here, the ultras and the indulgents simply posed a political threat to the dictatorship of the Committee of Public Safety. And therefore, Robespierre and his cabal needed to get rid of them. In this episode, though, we'll see the committee finalize that consolidation of power that leads directly to what is so-called historically the Great Terror. We're going to explore that term too. And the Great Terror ran the streets of Paris red with blood in the spring and into the summer of 1794. And in the process, it convinced a lot of people that Robespierre wasn't going to stop trimming along the edges of that narrow band of virtuous political purity until he had killed everyone that did not meet his exacting revolutionary standards. So on February 5th, 1794, 2 months before Danton and his pals were executed, Robespierre had defined those exacting revolutionary standards. And we talked about this speech last week. And I said, we're going to talk about that speech next week when I called it out, because it's too complex of a speech to have merited the amount of time it would have taken last week in the context of everyone else getting executed. But in this speech, on February 5th, 1794, to the convention from Robespierre, which was called A Report on the Principles of Public Morality, he laid out this philosophical framework that he believes should now guide public policy. And he started out by saying that up until now, the revolution had not been guided by any exact theory with precise rules of conduct. And that's true, right? It's been haphazard. It's been effectively, if you aren't keeping up with the flow of radical leftism, you were a dead man. And he's thought that time had come, though, to finally lay down some framework, some law. So he said, what is the goal to which we are headed? Well, he believed that to be the peaceful enjoyment of liberty and equality. And I'm paraphrasing from his speech. The reign of eternal justice, whose laws had not been inscribed in marble and stone, but in the hearts of all men. And this first section tonight is very much on the philosophy side of things, so taking us way back to when we explored Rousseau and Voltaire and all of those things to help set up the Enlightenment. So what Robespierre is talking about here is that he believes a democratic republic, not founded on mere laws, but that this republic in France was founded on something deeper psychologically and emotionally. So he's moving the revolution away from Montesquieu and toward Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And then he asked, what are the fundamental principles of popular democratic government? That is to say, the essential mainspring which sustains it and makes it move. Now, anyone who's been paying attention to this series or who knew Robespierre at the time, already kind of knew the answer. Of course, he said it's virtue, because he had this long-standing love affair with the concept of Roman Republican virtue. And luckily, being the occasionally good disciple of Rousseau that he was, Robespierre believed that virtue was natural to the people, and that it was only through corrupting influences from intriguers and despots external to them that virtue was corrupted. So it's worth noting here that I don't share this philosophical view. I am more a student of Machiavelli, who states that the default resting position of the human condition is non-virtuous, and that by default, humans in isolation will seek to take advantage of any situation in the absence of rules and repercussions. From that perspective, virtue is something that must be strived for and developed through self-evaluation, self-improvement, and discipline, which is pretty much the polar opposite of Rousseau and what Robespierre believed. Now, Robespierre said that naturally, the first rule of your political conduct should be to let all your measures tend to maintain equality and encourage virtue. He says the first care of the legislator should be to strengthen the principles on which government rests. So what Robespierre is saying is that first we must ensure that the people are virtuous, and then we can have a perfect republic. That's what he believes. He believes that if we can get the people to their natural state of virtue, then we can have a perfect governmental system. It's also important to note that this is radically different from the assumption of James Madison and the founders of the American Republic, which is, just catching its legs right now historically in our time frame, who explicitly built the Constitution of the United States on the basic fact that humans were not virtuous animals at all. So you could say to a degree that the U.S. Constitution stems from the base premise of Machiavelli and not Rousseau, and in terms what Robespierre believes. Maybe this is also why these two fledgling republics, who are only really about a decade apart, maybe this is why the new American Republic didn't really need to chop off heads in order to stabilize their new fledgling nation. Because the American governmental system that was trying to figure itself out in 1790, from 1780 to 1790, wasn't operating from this assumption that people were, by default, at a good center point, and that the problems were external. Robespierre then transitioned in this speech to talking about how to found this new idealized Republic of Virtue, because he recognized that the tempest of the times meant that virtue alone was not enough, which is contradictory to his own point, I believe. But he said the mainspring of popular government in peacetime is virtue. But amid revolution, it is both at once virtue and terror. Virtue without terror is fatal, he said. And terror without virtue is impotent. Terror is nothing but prompt, severe, and inflexible justice. It is therefore, according to Robespierre, terror is an emanation of virtue. It isn't until you said that which I realized how close in the day that America, it is, everyone goes back in time and says, the American Revolution is 1776, and that's true. And the war waged on until the early 1780s. But the Constitution doesn't come around until very close to the point that the French Ancien regime in the late 1780s is falling apart. They're really, really close in terms of actual being founding dates of true republics in the sense of, do you believe it was a republic in France? But Robespierre says terror is a aspect of, an emanation of virtue. So now we're getting, well, where we are getting is to the grit of it, is where virtue can only be achieved, according to Robespierre, when the wicked are purged from the body politique and the virtuous are scared into being anything but virtuous. Now, why would a person who is virtuous need to be scared into being anything but virtuous? Isn't virtue their base resting point? Shouldn't they be hovering around that naturally according to him? His own theory is contradictory in the sense that he believes in order to stay here, they need to be scared to stay here, when he says this is where they naturally reside. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But this entire speech that he's giving is about this political philosophy. But Robespierre also knows what you are about to ask, and so he asked it for you in this speech. But hasn't it been said that terror is the spring of despotic government? Does yours, speaking to French Republic, then resemble despotism? And he answered, yes. But the government in revolution is a despotism of liberty against tyranny. It's a force only intended to prevent, is force only intended to prevent crime. Is not the lightning of heaven not made to blast vice exalted? These are his words. Robespierre in this speech refers to the terror as the steel that glistens in the hands of the heroes of liberty. And thinking in the context of when this speech was delivered, this is before the ultras and the indulgence are executed. He's laying the groundwork in this for something a little crazier about himself. It's almost as if he was the only person who could see this, as Gilly just stated in chat, this cross-pollinated concept of virtue and fear that will lead France to some sort of promised land of democratic republican government. So where we are now with this speech is the belief that people are naturally virtuous, that they have been corrupted by something, and what is needed is a vanguard of warriors to clean out everything, standing between the people and their natural virtue, this natural virtuous resting point, which I don't believe exists. And then, according to Robespierre, of course this will manifest itself in a glorious republic of equality and liberty, where the nation will secure the comfort of the individual, and the individual prides themselves on the glory and prosperity of their country. So Robespierre is describing some sort of organism made of pure republican virtue that will then at some point disappear in a flash of white light up to a higher plane of political and economic existence. Or it could just, collapse under the weight of thousands of heads and be taken over by an obscure but quickly rising military officer from Corsica. I don't know. Robespierre delivered this great speech, and it was a great work of oratory. Whether you believe in what he's saying or agree with it, the speech itself is something you should read. Yeah, the answer is B, by the way. The answer is B. Rocket knows. She's read ahead. But in delivering this great speech, and it was possibly the defining political speech of his career, I believe it to be that. He gave several very important speeches, but this one probably defines the Great Terror for sure. It defines him in his final days for sure. And it defines the spring into summer momentum of the revolution, without doubt. But just as he delivered this speech, you'll remember last week we talked about how then he got sick. He took a month of effectively sick leave and stepped off the public stage. So he is
Remember
out.
to clonk that follow button.
He's out there, standing in front of this factional conflict that is still there between the ultras and the indulgents. And he delivers this grand manifesto, for lack of a better word to describe it, because it is his Republic of Virtue manifesto. And then it's pretty much as soon as he's delivered the speech, poof, he gets sick. He steps off the stage. And you'll remember that's the moment when he was also encouraging everybody to kind of tone it down a little bit, to say, hey, why don't we try to find the middle ground? And then when he got sick, everyone decided to ignore that. And that's when it got really nasty in Paris. Has anyone who ever delivered a manifesto had a good ending? Sure. Karl Marx had a decent ending. Karl Marx, fascinating person. We're going to learn about Karl Marx in a little while in this series, because we have to understand what we actually mean by the term anarchist and what we mean by the term communist. But Karl Marx had a pretty interesting life, and the Communist Manifesto gets slammed in the West because of the Cold War, but it's worth a read. Because a lot of stuff that you guys are talking about on the internet and wanting, things for everybody, a lot of those things are socio-communistic ideals. 2 years, a little while. Next year, maybe. We'll see. We still have to get to Napoleon, the Restoration, and the July Monarchy, and the revolutions of 1848. But hey, that's when Karl Marx will be a part of things. We'll get there when we get there. Yeah, so 5 years. Hey, you guys want me to go faster? I can start skipping stuff. I can just, give you the cliff notes. Talleyrand will come back sooner than all that. So there's Robespierre. He's sick, right? He is taking a month off, but when he came back in March, it was still clearly with this Republic of Virtue in his mind. Because he, you'll remember, immediately took aim at purging those dangerous factions that we talked about last episode. He believed these factions, again, were in and of themselves evil, because they divided the government from the people and the people from each other. And everyone who understands modern political science, even at a base level, realizes that some sort of constructive dissenting opposition is essential. You can't just have everyone agree on everything all the time. He believes that disagreement effectively is evil. All of it, he believed, of course, in France at the time, in 1794, was, being funded by foreign enemies. Which is why it was no problem at all for him to kill them all. They were not true citizens, but strangers. Alien enemies, outside of the protection of even human empathy. Now that concept, the concept of not true citizens, but strangers, alien enemies, not a concept to which you should give human empathy. That is the scary part. Because dehumanization is what has allowed every bloodthirsty madman in history to effectively kill whomever they wanted to. Pol Pot.
No way.
Yes way. Pol Pot, Hitler, Stalin in the modern sense. These are the guys who did this. They looked at who they believed to be less than human and said, well, because you're less than human, you don't belong here. And Robespierre is on that track at this point. He's seeing those who are not true citizens. And it's a scary term. What's a true citizen? He sees those who are not true citizens as nearing that Untermensch line we talked about that the Nazis had, where you're a subhuman. It becomes very easy to kill those you believe to be not or less than human. So, upon delivering the indictment of the indulgence, which we talked about last week when Danton and his buddies were arrested and then tried very quickly and killed. When this indictment was delivered to the convention, Robespierre's ally and collaborator, Louis Saint-Just, promised that this would be the end of the political killings. Now, we also said last week that that didn't turn out to be true. That with the last of the factions liquidated, promised Saint-Just, the process of virtuous regeneration could, of course, begin unimpeded. So looking back historically, it's very hard to tell if Saint-Just was just straight up lying to the convention, or if he was this tremendously self-deluded. But whichever it was, Robespierre and Saint-Just were not going to keep that promise. They had no intention of ending the political killing. So to ensure that the virtuous regeneration continued unimpeded, the Committee of Public Safety, Gilly's already on top of it. I wonder if they had a second wave of victims already in mind. Yeah, they had more than a second wave. The Committee of Public Safety, they had purged the General Assembly of the Paris Commune, which we also talked about last week. And they purged that central city government of Paris so that there would be one less cesspool for factionalism to spread out from. And anyone who was deemed insufficiently loyal, not to the nation, but to the committee, was barred from taking their seats in that General Assembly of the Paris Commune, which was effectively the legislative body for the city of Paris. And then we talked about the more prominent men of the commune were, of course, arrested and executed. Chalmette comes to mind. He was one of the leaders of dechristianization. And in their places, in the Paris Commune General Assembly, more reliable delegates were appointed. So this was like the king's letter sending people out of Paris without sending them out of Paris. Yeah, lettres de cachet were kind of like, you got to leave until I tell you it's okay to come back. This was more like, if you were suspect at this point of time in the French Revolution, you weren't going to go anywhere. You were going straight to the conciergerie so that you could be tried and executed pretty quickly. But in their place, as this assembly of the Paris Commune was being purged, more reliable, more loyal delegates to the committee were being appointed. And this task of who's going to sit in the chairs on the Paris Commune Assembly was handled personally and directly by Robespierre. And you would think that, oh, this guy just gave me political power. I owe him some loyalty. Generally, that's how it works. That's, quid pro quo. That's how that works. But in the context of this spring and into the summer of 1794, these appointments will become even more important to the climactic story of the Thermidorian reaction. Because Robespierre is going to establish a trend, and he has already done so, where you're my friend while you are politically useful to me. Claude Desbois and Billaud-Varenne fall into this. Remember, they were guys who were appointed to the Committee of Public Safety to mollify the sans-culottes, who are now no longer a threat. Wonder how long they're going to be around for. These now gentlemen have been placed in the Paris Commune Assembly. They were convenient appointees for Robespierre. And while he probably believed that him granting them power engendered loyalty from them to him, it's not going to work out that way. So following the purge of the Commune, Robespierre led the Committee of Public Safety to attack another hotbed of political factionism. This time, the target, as Gilly alluded to, he'll find another target, was no other body than the Committee of General Security. Now, we've talked about these two committees a lot. The Committee of Public Safety has dominated what we've talked about for several episodes, and we've kind of thrown the Committee of General Security into the narrative at times to make sure you understand that they are distinct and that they two bodies do different things. But it's easy to get these two committees confused. So I will again make them distinct here. The Committee of General Security predated the Committee of Public Safety. It had been the first attempt at creating an executive council to run the country. But for a variety of reasons, it didn't work the way it was supposed to. And it was supplanted by the Committee of Public Security in March of 1793. One of the reasons it didn't work, it didn't have enough power. So the pendulum reaction of that is to do what they did with the Committee of Public Safety and give it too much power. But that power transfer in March of 1793, after it was over, the Committee of General Security retained jurisdiction over domestic policing and the pursuit of counter-revolutionaries. So instead of being the de facto running fiat of France that it was intended to kind of be, it basically became a kind of national police force, or at least the body that oversaw a national police force. Now, during the consolidating moves, which culminated with the Law of 14 Frimaire, the Committee of General Security had been made subordinate to the Committee of Public Safety. They kind of coexisted up until that point, until the December 1793. And then they put the Committee of General Security subordinate to the Committee of Public Safety. The counter-revolutionary bit makes it sound like a secret police thing, people spying on each other. That, to a degree, except, the denunciation was pretty public. But remember, 14 Frimaire, December 1793, the Committee of General Security becomes subordinate to the Committee of Public Safety. But despite this nominal subservience, it really continued to operate as its own independent entity, and that makes sense to a degree. Intelligence agencies tend to operate parallel to the government and not really tell the government what they're doing a lot of the time, and it can be seen that maybe the Committee of General Security was kind of being that way. But given its mandate, it shouldn't surprise you that the leaders on the Committee of General Security tended to skew ultra. They tended to be more leftist radical. And a few of its leading members had been extremely anti-Christian and extremely pro-terror. So, way out in the weeds where the ultras live, who had just been executed by Robespierre. Excuse me. Get a drink real quick. So those same leaders who skewed ultra on the Committee of General Security did not miss the blatant shot across the bow that was fired their way by Robespierre on April 16th, 1794. Louis de Saint-Just came down to the floor of the convention, like he always did, walked down, basically a kid still, was in his mid-20s, walks down to the floor of the convention to introduce a new law, creating the Bureau of General Policing within the Committee of Public Safety. This new bureau would have jurisdiction over, you guessed it, domestic policing and the pursuit of counter-revolutionary suspects. And assigned to this new bureau, after it became law, were Robespierre, Saint-Just, and Georges Couthon, who's our friend who went out to Lyon in his wheelchair and then didn't have the heart to kill a lot of people. Yes, so now the Committee of General Security has no jurisdiction over anything. And obviously this new bureau was made to make the Committee of General Security redundant, and thus easily disposable. And knowing Robespierre, this probably meant purging and executing the suspected members of that committee as well. All that said, it should come as no surprise that some of those leaders on the Committee of General Security are the guys right out in front leading the Thermidorian reaction. It's also worth noting that Robespierre views factions as a threat to the Republic, right? And yet as he continues to trim on the edges of that ever-narrowing ribbon of the virtuous path, all he's doing is creating factions. In a way, Robespierre's paranoia was becoming self-fulfilling. By seeing enemies all around him and in every corner, he was making enemies all around him and in every corner. He was starting to denounce everyone in sight. In one Committee of Public Safety meeting, he made veiled threats at none other than Lazare Carnot, which you can see up there on the left side of the map. You'll remember that Carnot was the organizer of Victory. He's the author of the Levée en Masse, the implementer of the Amalgame, and he's pretty apolitical at this point. He's just focused on winning the War of the First Coalition. But he was also secure enough in his position as the organizer of Victory, because he was doing a heck of a job, that he scoffed openly at Robespierre and effectively told Robespierre, bring it on. However, feeling less secure on the committee were Jean-Marie Collot d'Herbois and Jacques-Nicolas Billaud-Varenne. So those are the two guys on the upper row, left to right. You'll remember Collot d'Herbois. He's the guy that went out and relieved Couthon in Lyon and made it streets run red. These were the two ultra-leaning members that were added to the committee after the insurrection of September 5th to satisfy the sans-culottes, right? But the sans-culottes were now pretty much broken as a political force. And these two guys, one of which just had professed his loyalty to the committee by not joining in the ultra-attempted insurrection in the spring of 1794, they now recognized that it might not be too long until they were also denounced and executed. And these are two of the 12, two of the guys sitting on the Committee of Public Safety. Carnot also sat on the Committee of Public Safety. But Robespierre's real boogeyman, the monster under the bed for Robespierre these days, was an alleged conspiracy being hatched by old allies of Danton and returning representatives on mission who had been recalled after the Law of 14 Frimaire. Specifically, Robespierre was worried about Joseph Fouché. And you'll remember Fouché is middle row, far right column. He's the survivalist, right? He's the guy that's going to be Napoleon's, Minister of Police. Fouché was the guy who got the dechristianization ball rolling. That's the guy Robespierre is really afraid of right now. And it's really honestly baffling that Fouché was not arrested and executed already, right? He was back in Paris in early April, and he would have made a juicy target along with his dechristianization buddy Chalmette, who's now dead. But for whatever reason, he wasn't scooped up. Now, I don't know. Yeah, Fouché begins dodging bullets here. It's a good way to put it, Turi. Now, I don't know if there was a conspiracy or not between Danton's old allies and those returning representatives. It's a plausible enough theory, and there's no evidence one way or the other to support or convincingly deny it existed. At least I'm not able to say it existed or not before Robespierre started dreaming it up and talking about it. But after Robespierre dreamed it up, and started to talk about it. Well, the allies of Danton and those returning representatives on mission, they got word that the virtuous devil Robespierre suspected them, and they, of course, then got to work on an actual conspiracy to overthrow Robespierre. Because it was either that, or it was going to be all their heads. So Robespierre creates probably his own enemy again. It's through this conspiracy by proxy of his own paranoia. It's repetitive in the spring of 1794, where Robespierre is now pretty powerful. He's the swing vote, and realistically the lead vote on the Committee of Public Safety. He is dictating who dies across the entire nation. And he's jumping at shadows. I don't know if it was guilt at killing people who had been his allies for so long, or that he just was cracking, or that he just wasn't that stable to begin with. Probably a combination of all those factors. What's up, Apple? But at this point, as we lead into the late spring and early summer in 1794, Robespierre is manifesting his paranoia into tangible demons for himself in France. He's creating a monster within the Paris Commune Assembly. He creates this conspiracy, I believe, out of thin air, because I can find nothing that suggests it exists before Robespierre puts mouth to it and starts saying, well, the allies of Danton are coming for me. All those representatives on mission coming back that we thought were either A, too bloodthirsty, or B, not bloodthirsty enough, well, they're all out to get me now. Then here are the names. And once he starts naming them, they go, we know how this is going to end. So of course we've got to do something to save our own butts. So a month later, the Committee of Public Safety made another consolidation move when they decided that the various revolutionary tribunals that had sprung up over the past year could no longer be trusted to handle revolutionary justice. We're talking about out in the provinces, all of the individual places, which they had sent people to expressly to do this, to set up tribunals everywhere, to make it faster, to make sure that the revolution, now through us under the law of 14 free mayor, was being executed the way we're telling you to. Now they're so far gone that they say, well, yeah, even though we're delivering verbatim instructions and telling local municipalities to do nothing other than what we say, those tribunals are still not adequate. They're suspect. So does this mean wagon loads are now going to make their way to Paris? It sure does. And what happens when wagon loads of prisoners make their way to Paris? We'll find out after a break. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for the host earlier, or the raider earlier, Richie. Thanks for the host as well, my friends. We'll take a break, stand up, get a drink, stretch your legs, go to the bathroom, and all that cool stuff. And we'll be back in just a few minutes. remember to clonk that follow button. Hello, chair. You don't want to go there, that's fine. You got your wheel stuck in a rut, that's cool. Welcome back. Hopefully you all stretch your legs. So, a month after this whole shot across the bow was done to the Committee of General Security, the Committee of Public Safety made that next move to consolidate their power. And that's really what it was, right? It wasn't so much that, yes, it partially was they were control freaks and they needed to directly administer everything. They, instead of micromanaging it, they just brought it all to them. But they decided that the revolutionary tribunals, which they had helped establish all over France, were now no longer trustworthy enough to handle revolutionary justice. Some of those tribunals were going bananas, right? They were going off the rails crazy. Well, the Law of 14 Brumaire was supposed to fix this, but they were just indiscriminately slaughtering people. Because the committee was basically saying, when somebody meets this criteria of crime, execute. Well, what's the criteria of the crime? It was still left up to the tribunals. And then other tribunals, like, we talked about in Marseille, weren't doing very much at all. They weren't doing very little to purge enemies from France, the non-citizens, the collaborators, the less than human non-French, right? So, on May 18th, 1794, the various provincial tribunals were all closed. And that meant that all suspects would be carted back to Paris to have their fate determined. And as Gilly just said in chat, this decision inevitably led to, you absolutely are right, sir, massive overcrowding in the Paris prisons. So almost overnight, the pressures of overcrowding in those prisons needed to be addressed. And addressed they were. But I'm going to do a bait and switch on you. Does that include the Bastille? The Bastille is not a prison anymore. But we're not going to talk about that yet. Before we get into the Law of 22 Prairial, which is what's going to help us deal with the overcrowding situation, and the beginning in earnest of the so-called Great Terror, we need to go take another trip back through Robespierre's brain and deal with his fancy new religion. And I'm not talking about the cult of reason, which is what the de-Christianizers wanted to replace Christianity with. Remember, they were going around toppling crosses in cemeteries and stripping altars and taking all the iconography out of churches, and they even went so far as to rededicate Notre Dame. No, that whole cult of Marat comes later. But unlike the ultras, who viewed religion as the enemy of France, right? They believed that religious dogmatism was the problem, that atheism was the answer. Robespierre viewed religion with its trappings and everything as one of the great vehicles for the promotion of virtue. And with the Paris Commune now under his direct control, because he just put people that he believed to be his, they at least were under his thumb for now, it goes without saying that all those de-Christianization efforts we talked about, which had spread throughout France, they came to a screeching halt. But Robespierre did not intend to follow that stop to de-Christianization up with some sort of re-Christianization of France. He wanted to follow the cult of reason up instead by introducing a new cult, which could bridge the divide between the old superstitions and the new rationalism of the Enlightenment. And so since the Cult of Reason had burst onto the scene a few months earlier, the whole time, Robespierre had been cooking up a new civic religion of his own. One that he hoped would supplant the sacrilegious atheism of Jacques Hébert and all of his dechristianization supporters. And he called it the Cult of the Supreme Being. On May 7th, 1794, Georges Couthon came down to the convention and announced that in 1 month's time, there would be a great festival of the Supreme Being. No, Robespierre is not the said Supreme Being. Municipalities across the nation were ordered to prepare for celebrations to coincide with the Paris launch of this new Cult of the Supreme Being. And with almost no notice, all of those municipalities scrambled to kind of put something together. And in an ironic twist, all those local leaders simply dusted off the props that they had used for the Festival of Reason that they had been instructed to celebrate back in October, and they just didn't tell Robespierre. But in Paris, there would obviously be no such recycling. No materials that were previously used would be brought back out in Paris. And Robespierre handed planning of the festival to Jacques-Louis David, the great painter, right? The great sculptor. He's a fantastic artist. He's crazy, but he was a fantastic artist. And at this point, he was the all-purpose art director of the French Revolution. And he is top row, right corner. And that is actually him doing a self-portrait there. Now, David, having stage managed the funeral of Jean-Paul Marat and the festival of the unity and indivisibility of the Republic, he was becoming a pro at, organizing the revolution's theme nights. And for the Festival of the Supreme Being, he tried to outdo his own high standards.
No way!
Yes way. Did he do weddings? I don't know. I don't think so. But he had construction crews working around the clock. Because he had a month, right? Building. Things are getting outright weird now. They're about to get real weird here in a minute, Terry. But David had construction crews building something. Around the clock. Working on something. Out in the middle of the Champ de Mars. And then he devised an elaborate procession to celebrate both the Cult of the Supreme Being and the man who was going to bring it to France, Maximilien Robespierre. On June 4th, Robespierre was conveniently enough elected to be president of the National Convention. You'll remember that's the presiding officer over all these legislative bodies, right? The president of whatever body is the guy who decides who gets to speak and moves legislation forward, etc. And this was so that he could lead the procession and deliver major speeches for the festivals of the Supreme Being. What's up, Fletch? Not because he was some sort of would-be tyrant with a messiah complex. And so on June 8th, 4 days after he was elected president of the convention, basically for the month, Robespierre stood next to one of Jacques-Louis David's most ingenious works of public art. It was a giant effigy of atheism. Now, everyone had to have been wondering what Robespierre was doing, delivering a speech dedicated to the Supreme Being, standing in front of a statue of atheism. However, upon completing the speech, it all became pretty clear. At the climax of the oratory, the effigy was lit on fire, and as it burned, a second statue hidden inside the first started to emerge. And you have to think about it in the day, right? That seems pretty everyday, CGI stuff to us these days, but it's 1794. A statue within a statue, you set one on fire and another one pops out of it. That's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome stage effects for the time. When the fire and the smoke cleared, a great statue of wisdom was left, standing in the destruction of atheism. And everyone was, of course, suitably impressed. And then when the statue within a statue trick was played out, the procession moved to the Champ de Mars proper, where everyone beheld what Jacques-Louis David's construction crews had been up to. It was a huge replica of a mountain, and this thing was big. It was made from cardboard and plaster. On top of it was a liberty tree. On top of it, or just next to it, was this liberty tree, and then a 50-foot high column anchoring the mountain, on top of which on that column was a statue of Hercules, which at this point in David's cycles of preferences was one of his favorite symbols for this phase of the French Revolution. This time the statue of Hercules held liberty in his hands, protecting her from danger. And then, once everyone's gathered around this mountain with the liberty tree and the pole and the column with Hercules on top, I'm not making this up, Robespierre descended from the mountain to deliver another stirring lecture on the glories of virtue and the Republic. So here he is. This thing's at least 50 foot tall. And he's walking down from the mountaintop. Robespierre at this point is presenting himself as nothing less than Jacobin Moses, coming back down from obtaining the path forward for the chosen people, the true French revolutionaries. Told you it's gonna get weirder, Terry. So to the growing list of men who now considered Robespierre to be the most dangerous man in France, watching all of this could have done nothing but give all of them ulcers, because clearly Robespierre was kind of trending in the direction now of crazy Roman emperor land, right? Like Commodus land. Caligula land. And then 2 days after the Festival of the Supreme Being in Paris, everyone's ulcers got a little more acute when Louis de Saint-Just came down to the convention to deliver the latest new decree from the Committee of Public Safety. And it's around this time that Saint-Just also gets that nickname, the Angel of Death. We talked about it last week, but this is really when he gets that name. Because he was always the one coming down to the convention from the committee to deliver the news that this or that batch of former stalwart revolutionaries were not enemies of the state. And for example, right now, when he announces what is effectively the beginning of the Great Terror, he didn't call it that, but that's a post facto label slapped onto it by historians. What he brought down on June 10th is now the infamous Law of 22 Prairial, June the 2nd, 1794. I wish it was written on stone tablets, Duke, because as you read about it, it's exactly what it feels like, right? The whole imagery I have is that he's actually coming down around the side of the mountain in kind of a slow spiral to its base. And that's really what my mental picture of Robespierre is at the time. Like, it would be better if they said he was actually wearing a toga. That would have been better, because they did have this love affair with Rome. So, Saint-Just comes down with the Law of 22 Prairial, and it's the thing that they just got done watching Robespierre come down the mountainside to deliver another speech on the path forward for the chosen people of France, this narrow band of true revolutionaries that he saw as truly virtuous. What the Law of 22 Prairial did is it took the already very streamlined revolutionary tribunal process. Remember, The trials can, at this point, prior to this law, not run longer than 3 days, and once guilt has been even sniffed at, that's over. We've already seen show trials, right? Like Marie Antoinette's trial where she was, barred from having legal counsel, but she still technically had the right to legal counsel then. Not anymore. Not under the law of 22 Prairial. Remember all that stuff last week from Danton? His right to call witnesses? Well, he was right. He had the right to call witnesses. But not anymore. The law of 22 Prairial made it virtually impossible for a defendant to actually defend themselves and put into law the barriers to that defense that had so far just been penciled in as the way to do things when needed. It was now law that you couldn't have counsel. It was law that you couldn't call witnesses in your own defense. As Terry just said, they fixed the glitch. They fixed the thing that was every once in a while speed bumping them when one of these more high-profile trials would come along. They cannot afford more trials like Danton's to occur with all those new prisoners in Paris. Another very good point. But also a part of the law of 22 Prairial were a fun new array of potential crimes. Like, it was now a crime to slander patriotism or to spread false news. Here's the best one. It was illegal to seek to inspire disagreement. I don't know how you don't, right? The term inspiring disagreement. How do human beings not aspire to disagreement all the time by default by having an opinion? So, effectively, espousing your opinion was illegal. Yeah, by having wrong opinions. Here's the best part about the law of 22 Prairial. I mean, the best, but it's all nuts, right? The whole law is crazy. But citizens were not only now empowered to apprehend and denounce people, so you didn't need the police anymore. Your neighbor could denounce you and arrest you and take you to the tribunal. But they were required to do it legally. Failure to come forward and denounce someone who you knew to be breaking the law was now considered to be proof of your own complicity, legally. You can imagine how this law and the you must denounce your neighbor or else led to an atmosphere of paranoia, mutual distrust, and absolute hair trigger accusations, because no one wanted to be on. Falsely accusing someone wasn't illegal. Failing to accuse was illegal. The neighbor who's crotchety about your fence coming over onto his property would absolutely love this law. Yes, they would. And finally, there would be no longer any middle ground. The reformed, because it's now the third time they've reformed it, tribunal now only had two possible verdicts: acquittal, or you guessed it, execution. There was no 3-month sentence for petty theft. You're going to die. With the prisons of Paris already overstuffed. And that was indeed one of the driving forces behind the law, the closing of all the departmental tribunals and all the people being stuffed into the prisons in Paris. The newly reformed tribunal got to work clearing out the damned. executions in the capital had been waning, been trending down during the first few months of 1794. But in June, when this law gets passed, they skyrocket again. We've talked about in prior episodes that there are about 2,600 official victims of the terror in Paris. And by official victim, we've always meant that they processed through the tribunal to the guillotine. Of those 2,600 official victims in Paris, 2/3 of them are killed right now, June and July 1794. And that's why it's called the Great Terror. But in the grand scheme of things, still remember that the total number of people killed in the terror is about 16,000 official victims, right? Again, officially processed through some sort of tribunal system. Thus, these 1,500 victims in Paris in June and July 1794 only represent, it's a little under 10% of the total victims of the Reign of Terror. So the Great Terror is only about 10% of the damage done. Officially. We're going to get to one of those unofficial ways later today. So yeah, the pace had quickened dramatically under the law of 22 Prairial, and had the Thermidorian reaction not come along in a month to shut it all down, it might have just kept accelerating on that quick curve up to infinity. But the worst of the terror is still in places like Lyon and Nantes, and in the bloodbath that followed Napoleon's liberation of Toulon. Not at Napoleon's hands, but at the hands of the Committee of Public Safety, who swept into the city after Napoleon liberated it and said, "Look at all those traitors who had let the British Navy sit in our dockyard." Imagine how well that went for the people of Toulon. So this label, the Great Terror, when you evaluate it from a historical perspective, it betrays a Paris-centric worldview from the people who are writing things down. The historians who dubbed it the Great Terror were so focused on events in Paris that, sure, it was a tremendous upswing of bloodshed in Paris in June and July 1794, but they're tunnel visioned on it. They can't see past Paris, which has been something that's been repetitive as a theme throughout 30 episodes, that it's always Paris first and everything else second, which is why this gets dubbed this way. This is when the terror was the worst, in Paris. But the terror had been far worse in other areas of France prior to 22 Prairial. But the Great Terror in Paris has one interesting and morbid thing going for it. The terror, the Great Terror, in June and July 1794, is when the Reign of Terror most resembles what you have in your mind from popular culture. The traditional portrayals of the terror, the streets running red with blood, everybody accusing everybody. Just the general anarchy of that entire situation of one person can easily condemn another person and send them to the tribunal and get them convicted. That whole concept that you have, like Les Mis presents this as well when it refers back to the terror. But when you start talking about the terror and you don't have the background we've built from, either reading the source material for what is this series or paying attention to this series, the sense of what you have of the Reign of Terror is the Great Terror. That's what's been projected to you. That is, it was a bunch of zealous Jacobin revolutionaries cutting off the heads of every damned aristocrat they could get their hands on, right? That's the mental image you have. And everyone has this thing where it's aristocrats. But in the main, aristocrats make up a very small percentage of the victims of the Great Terror. Because we all know that most of them were smart enough to emigrate the hell out of France a long time ago at this point, right? They could see the writing on the wall. You could see that they were all in trouble. Maybe not the Duc d'Orléans. And Carrier was so proud of sinking barges just to get upstaged by this stupid law. Yeah. So it was mostly peasants from the Vendée getting beheaded, and not dukes from Versailles. However, during the Great Terror, this 2-month phase of the Reign of Terror, whole noble families were targeted to be executed, including Lafayette's. Their only crime really being that they were noble. And that's important. For those of you that read Mike Duncan's book, and we've talked about that book since it came out during our series, The Hero of Two Worlds. There's a whole section in that book about how close Lafayette's immediate family got to the guillotine, and how the Thermidorian reaction was just simply excellent timing for them, because most of them escaped. But again, whole noble families during this 2-month period were directly targeted. It was simply a crime to be noble at this point. And aristocrats make up close to 30%.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
Aristocrats make up close to 30% of the victims during this 2-month period. And if you throw the clergy in, the other estate no one likes, you're now talking about half of the executions in Paris were either aristocratic or clergymen. Or clergywomen. So when modern people portray the terror as a process of exterminating the nobility, they can be reminded that, yeah, that's true, but only really in these 2 months of 1794. There's one other interesting thing about the Great Terror in Paris. It's probably the thing that undoes Robespierre and gets him overthrown. We've seen the bloodiness of the revolution thus far tracks pretty well with the fortunes of the French army. If things were going good on the frontier, there weren't really any large-scale massacres. Things going badly? Well, it was the Allied invasion of France that triggered the insurrection of August the 10th and then subsequently the September massacres. And then after Valmy and the French army push into Belgium, things were pretty stable. And then Dumouriez defected, and things started to turn against France, and then everything went to hell. It was the great crisis of the summer of 1793 with the Federalist Revolt and the Vendée Uprising, along with all the setbacks in Belgium, that led to the Reign of Terror in the first place. So you would think that if the Reign of Terror is being ratcheted up to the Great Terror, as it is in the summer of 1794, that something bad must have happened to the French army. Some great defeat or great danger. But no. Things are actually going pretty great for France militarily. And this is what makes the Great Terror unique. As opposed to pretty much every other time that mass slaughter had been somehow politically justified, it had always been done so by the need to expedite things due to the danger that France and pretty much Paris was in, right? That there was some military crisis or some impending foreign doom that meant we got to kill all these prisoners to free up the street people who are so concerned about them breaking out of jail and killing their family so that they can go fight. That's not the case here. And so it's the second time in 1794 that a precedent gets broken here in the French Revolution. First it was, as long as you were on the leading edge of left radicalism, you were safe. The ultras learned that wasn't true. And now we're ratcheting up the death toll and the pace of it, but we don't have a politically reasonable justification for it. had to relieve the pressure of the prisons, but did they? Because the reason the pressure in the prisons had to be relieved in the September massacres was not because that they were legitimately concerned about the overcrowding problem. Danton justified it because he said, if we don't kill all these people, basically shove them in the hallways and let people stab them to death, the common foot soldier we need in the streets of Paris will not leave Paris to fight. That was the reason. And now they don't have that reason. But they're still ratcheting up the death count. And when the Thermidorian reaction hits, Robespierre's enemies are going to be very quick to point this difference out. So we're going to take one more break. We'll come back and we're going to circle this episode in for its landing by discussing where we are on all those war fronts, right? We haven't talked about anything except the Vendée and the Federalist Uprising for a while. So we're going to check in everywhere, which is why there are red boxes on the map tonight, because I'm going to zoom in so you can see what we're talking about. You'll also notice that this map is now out of date. We're in 1794. I just don't have a map that bridges me to Napoleon. But once we get into Napoleon's campaigns, this map will go bye-bye. You find it interesting as well that the Great Terror is mostly led from the top instead of being led by the masses, freaking out and rioting. Well, it is now. 22 Prairial gives the masses that freaking out, right? Because think about it. You and your neighbor, let's just say playing your music loud is a crime. And if you hear your neighbor playing the music loud and you don't say something, then the guy on the other side of the wall is going to say, well, that guy didn't report him, right? It leads to that concept you have, Gilly, where you're surprised to find out it's from the top down because you're fed the idea that it's from the bottom up. It was more from the bottom up during the Great Terror. The drive of prisoners into prisons was from the bottom up, thanks to 22 Prairial. But again, it's only 2 months. And we've illustrated how the Reign of Terror was much longer and not directed that way for the majority of its existence. Yeah, they're all freaking out because they have a gun to their head.
Yes, I'm excited about this.
So we'll take that break. We're going to come back. We're going to explore the frontiers and all of those war fronts and see just how well Lazare Carnot's vision to victory has been going, and check in with a bunch of generals too. So we got about another 30 or 40 minutes of talking and then the quiz. Stick around for that, participate, and yeah, we'll be right back. Stand up, get a drink, stretch your legs at least. I'll talk to you in a few. That's weird that those are playing twice. We're going to let them go and hopefully they don't loop. An anonymous gifter gifted 5 tier 1 subs to the community. Rex, Polly, Kays, Psy, which is interesting because he's a tier 3 sub, and Fletch. Thank you very much and welcome in Manny. So, we're going to take a trip around France pretty much and into Europe a little bit because, as we just talked about, the thing that sets apart 1794 in general is its trend breaking, and that trend breaking will lead to the end of Act 1 of this whole thing. Like, literally an episode away from it, before everything that we've learned about thus far will be in the books, and we'll be looking at a whole new structure. But we talked about how the Great Terror was ratcheting up the body count at a time when there was literally no justification for it. The justification, in quotation marks, being that, excuse me, being that prior massacres.
No way!
Yes, prior massacres, prior killing sprees, prior decisions to eradicate enemies had all been based in the idea of some threat to the French army. So we have to take a tour. I don't know, Sai. Either way. Tier 1, Tier 3. I appreciate it all. It all goes to DAV. By the way, I owe you guys a report on that. I haven't reformatted the graphic for 2021. That'll be done before the next episode. It just had other things in my brain I've got to get to paper, like the whole Black Knight thing. So, anyway, in order to make sure that next episode, all of Robespierre's enemies can come back to Paris and say to him, wait a minute. There's no emergency here. What's with the bloodshed? Let's go take a tour and see where everything is so that their position's justified next week. And we'll start this off by having a look out here in the Vendée. The Vendée uprising took place in that green barber pole area, generally speaking. And after that failed run up to Granville, which we talked about 2 episodes ago, which marked the end of the Catholic and Royal Army proper as an organized force, the Republican forces settled into the Vendée to brutally, and I mean brutally, even for French Revolutionary standards, brutally reassert control of the region and punish the rebels, which pretty much meant everybody. And as Gilly alluded to, we've already talked about the horrors unleashed by Jean-Baptiste Carrier and his Republican baptisms, where he put people on barges that had plugs designed to be pulled from them so that as they were bound and tied in the Loire River, they simply drowned when the barge sank. And then they'd raise the barge back up, put the plugs back in, put more people on it. But what he was up to in Nantes, and that was just a drop in the bucket compared to the bloody flood that washed across the Vendée beginning in 1794. It begins to escalate to the level of war crime. Oh, it's way beyond that. I mean, yeah, for sure, it's a war crime. Everything they're doing is a war crime. But there's no definition of that yet. But what happens in the Vendée beginning in 1794, starts in January of 1794, is referred to historically as the Infernal Columns. And I've mentioned it here and there. We're going to talk about it tonight, and then we're just going to leave it because it's horrible. The Infernal Columns had been first cooked up as an idea back in August of 1793, when the fires of insurrection were still raging out of control, back when federalism was, still a huge threat. And the war in the Vendée was anything but settled. But it had taken 6 months to get the Infernal Columns, as they are called, organized. And then to make the decision that, yeah, we're really going to do this. So 12 French army columns, numbering about 65,000 men, and under the command of an otherwise innocuous general named Louis-Marie Tarot, who is bottom right, pencil sketch. They were to march into the Vendée with a single mission. That mission was exterminate the civilian population. Yeah, that's harsh. And it may seem harsh. But there was a simple, if extremely brutal, calculus at work here. As many leaders know throughout history who have faced a guerrilla insurgency, it's nearly impossible to differentiate innocent civilians from armed fighters. It's why uniforms exist, by the way. It's why military forces are supposed to be in uniform, so that you can differentiate fighters from those innocent civilians. Ask the forces that were marching across the French and the U.S. and Allied forces in the 50s, 60s, and 70s who were marching across Vietnam, how hard it was to differentiate between combatant and civilian. Ask me and my generation who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan how hard it is when you're fighting an irregular force, how hard it is to be sure that that's a combatant and that's a civilian. It's impossible. And that's the calculus at work here. I'm not trying to say anything like this was okay. It was not okay. We're going to get to the anybody can pick up a gun and shoot it thing when we get to World War I as well, because the Germans accused the Belgians of that. Anybody can pick up a gun and shoot it except Killy. It's fair. So the idea that the whole civilian population of the Vendée had to be eradicated stems from this whole problem with a guerrilla war. But further in the minds of the National Convention, not just the Committee of Public Safety, there were no innocent people in the Vendée. There were the men who had been fighting, and then there were their families who had kept them fed, supplied, and hidden. And that's very much what the Viet Cong did in Vietnam. So, through that logic, they're all collectively guilty. And at the time that this whole concept was being forged, the traditional war was still raging in the Vendée. So this drastic policy, which borders on genocide and is certainly a war crime, seems justifiable to them. But with the benefit of hindsight, as the infernal columns actually got moving in 1794 and plunging into the Vendée, with the Catholic and Royal Army now a beaten and broken military force, they'd been beaten and beaten again and beaten more. It now just looks like murderous, destructive revenge, and that's not a good look. So the columns got moving on January 24th, 1794, and they carried out their orders. They killed men and women and children. They destroyed homes, burned villages, and destroyed everything in their path. And then they just moved on and did it again. And then moved on and did it again. So just as Robespierre is droning on about the virtue of virtue, the infernal columns were cutting a truly terrifying swath of destruction through the Vendée that puts Sherman's march to the sea to shame. And some of the numbers that come out of the infernal columns are staggering. Something approximating 20,000 to 40,000 people were massacred in the Vendée between January and May 1794. None of those deaths are counted in the official death tally of the Reign of Terror, because none of those people in the Vendée who are under the boot of the infernal column were processed by any form of a tribunal. They were simply killed with guns, knives, clubs, torches, and presumably a few were killed, with the bare hands of the soldiers that were rolling through. This ugly slaughter even turned the stomachs of the men carrying it out. And it is without a doubt one of the most unjustifiably horrible things that happened in a decade of rampant, unjustifiably horrible bloodshed in France. After the coming Thermidorian reaction, the commander of the columns, General Thibault, will be arrested, but eventually he will be acquitted by the tribunal who tries him. Because, after all, he was just following orders. And the post-Nuremberg, post-World War II trials, the Geneva Convention had not established this excuse as insufficient for following amoral orders and committing war crimes yet. So Thibault walks. At least for this, he walks. But whatever moral judgment we can pass on the Republic's conduct in the Vendée, one thing is certain. In June of 1794, the region posed no immediate threat to the Republic because it was simply too busy being exterminated. And so we fall back to, well, the Vendée certainly wasn't a justifiable reason or threat for the Great Terror to have happened. So what about the other great threat the Republic had faced in 1793? The Federalist Uprising, right? Well, Toulon, down here on the Mediterranean, had been the last holdout. And it had been taken, as we talked about 2 episodes ago, gloriously by Napoleon back in December 1793. By June 1794, federalism had been rotting in an open grave for about 6 months. It simply wasn't a thing anymore. And so there is, of course, no threat from federalism. No threat that justifies the Great Terror. And let me make sure the map goes right back to where I want it to be instead of being off center as it is now. There we go. So we've established that there were no major internal emergencies in the summer of 1794, right? The 2 things that justified the Reign of Terror in the first place really simply aren't a thing anymore. What about the foreign frontiers? Because that pressure had been justification for the September massacres, at least. Well, when you have a look around, it's pretty much the same story. The Spanish had penetrated across the Pyrenees in 1793. We talked about that. But a reinforced French line had pushed them back in the spring of 1794. And then those French troops would just keep rolling into Spain. And by the end of this year, by the end of 1794, France will actually be occupying Spanish territory. Along the Alps, so we're talking down here, along the Alps, the French made an abortive push into the Piedmont, which is an area of modern Italy, called the Piedmont because it's one of the most fertile crop-growing areas in the world. they pushed into the Piedmont, and then they were pushed back out of the Piedmont, but there was nothing that manifested itself as a massive threat to France. They didn't push further into France after the French army was pushed out of the Piedmont. So there's no threat there. There's no threat along the Alps front, for lack of a better way to describe it, because it really isn't a front. But then you had the Rhine front, which I've never done a great job of explaining this to you guys, but this is the Rhine front. We've not spent much time there, and things there were a little bit more sticky. But still, by the end of the first half of 1794, the front was summarized by several French thrusts being turned back by the Allies. Not a major French defeat or imminent invasion. And it's also worth mentioning here that the Rhine front could have been a major weak point for the French. Had it not been for the furious and nearly superhuman energy of Louis de Saint-Just. Because look where the Rhine front is, and then look where Paris is. And I'll just draw a nice little circle around Paris for you guys right now. Look where Paris is.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
Saint-Just, who's dead center in our, grid of people. Man, we talked about, boy, you could call people on the Committee of Public Safety a lot of things, but not lazy. He was the epitome of that. Just after the Girondins were executed in October 1793, Saint-Just was actually dispatched to reorganize the army of the Rhine, which was apparently suffering from poor morale and a general breakdown of discipline, which were major threats if that was allowed to continue. So Saint-Just sweeps in from Paris to the Rhine and whipped them into shape. Remember, he had been a colonel in the National Guard at age 21. But unlike most military disciplinarians who like to just thrust discipline down from the top, Saint-Just was extremely sympathetic to the enlisted troops. He listened to them and not just what the officers told him. He paid attention to the complaints of these put-upon privates, and he had no qualms about investigating what they were saying, finding out if the officer who was being accused had done it, and if they had, just shooting them, and then replacing them with someone who was more competent. It's brutal, but it made the officer corps of the Army of the Rhine far more effective because he put effective leadership in place there. The ends were great. The means, maybe murdering officers, not the way to go there, but he also solved the problems on the Rhine front. I can say a lot of things about Louis Saint-Just. He is a murderer, conspirator, general bad guy. Boy, did he do a lot. When the Law of 14 Frimaire passed, the army, just like everything else, now answered to the Committee of Public Safety, right? Yeah, highly effective. That's a good way to describe Saint-Just. As the committee's representative, Saint-Just just dismissed officers he deemed insufficiently energetic and elevated two new generals of very poor lineage who otherwise may have simply languished in obscurity had not the revolution and Saint-Just intervened. The two notable generals, and they're bringing their names back up here for reasons because they are important later, that Saint-Just elevates while he's out on the Rhine are Lazare Hoche, hopefully that name rings a bell, and Jean-Charles Pichegru. The latter, Pichegru, was nothing more than the son of a peasant. Now, hopefully, you do remember good Lazare Hoche from way back in episode 1.8 when we talked about the Women's March on Versailles. Yes, 22 episodes ago. When Hoche was the first guy to get to Louis and his family after Louis had let Marie Antoinette in from that crawl space. And he and his guardsmen were the ones who took the oath to defend them on the spot and kept the royal family from being massacred. Yes, the guy who saved them from the mob. That's Lazar Hoche. Now, General Lazar Hoche. I told you at the time, he's going to come back around. 22 episodes later, here he is. Now, being promoted to general by Louis de Saint-Just. So with the army of the Rhine now sorted out and under new leadership, Hoche and Pichegru, the French spent December 1793 defeating the Allied armies arrayed against them and holding the line ably on the Rhine front. By the spring of 1794, there was another shakeup that was a little bit too high school drama to get into, and we'll kind of cover it later, where Pichegru denounced Hoche, and Hoche got arrested but didn't get executed, and he's still alive. The context of that's for another day. The bottom line for us right now, as we roll into next episode, is that there is no military crisis on the Rhine frontier in June 1794. There's not one on the Spanish frontier. So that brings us to the all-important Belgian frontier. Where, far from a crisis, the French armies were about to achieve actual permanent ascendancy for a long time. This region was, it's the lowlands. There's no prominent geographical barriers in the way along the Belgian frontier apart from some rivers. So this is where both sides in the War of the First Coalition continued to concentrate their troops in the spring of 1794. The French had nearly 200,000 men on the Belgian front against about 150,000 allies. But remember, this is a French army that now has the levée en masse in effect, combined with the amalgame, which was that buddy system, right? That every new recruit is paired with a veteran. Not, let's just send a regiment of raw recruits out there. So this meant that not only were the French numerically superior by 50,000 men, but they were also not in any sort of danger of being some pushover, self-defeating force like they had been in the past. And then also, after working along the Rhine and having it had paid off so handsomely, Saint-Just came up to the Belgian front and did the same thing for the Army of the North. He brought in strict discipline and a sense of purpose and effective leadership. That is when he's, not literally shuttling back and forth between these places to Paris to hand out death sentences to the enemies of the committee. The Allies, for their part, had given up on that strategy of, let's just let France collapse on its own, because that wasn't going to happen. And so the Allies planned to open 1794 by carving out a road to Paris and then charging hard at it to kill the revolutionary beast once and for all. Now, they had tried this originally and it didn't work, and now they're going to try it again against a force that's far better than them now. So the Allies, they laid siege to another one of those frontier fortresses. We've talked about that before. And they, spent April successfully fending off French relief attempts of that fortress. But then the French opened up a whole new front away from that besieged city and scored a bunch of, pretty hard fought, but victories. And then they suffered a defeat at a town called Tournai at the end of May. But a month later, the French and the Allies squared off at this is a French word I actually struggle with. Fleurus. Fleurus. The S is actually pronounced, which is why it throws me. Fleurus. The French and the Allies basically brought the bulk of their forces to bear on each other at Fleurus on June 26th. The French were led by Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, and we've talked about him before in the context that he will be one of Napoleon's marshals. There's Jourdan on your map over here, this guy right there. Jourdan was that guy who kind of rolled in and was no nonsense. He didn't have time for the politics and the BS and somehow got away with it. He had run that string of victories out of Dunkirk back in October, but then he had actually been fired for insubordination, because we talked about the curse of the Army of the North. Duke, 2 a.m., glad you could stop in. The rest of this will be on YouTube. If you want to catch the end of the story here tonight, you can hit !YT to get that link. And there is a dedicated playlist to the French Revolution there if you want to see how it all ends. But I appreciate you stopping in. It's good to see you. Again, if you would give Duke Whiskey a follow, looking for a daytime post-Permanoob stream, he's at the right time. He's firing his stuff up pretty much right as Perm shutting things down about 1 p.m. Eastern. So consider popping in and seeing how things are. Seeing if you enjoy his stream. So, remember, Jourdan had led the victorious charge out of the fighting around Dunkirk, but he had actually been fired under that whole curse of the Army of the North for insubordination and almost lost his head. But he was recalled to the army after that French defeat at Tournai. And he ends up getting credit for one of the greatest French, quote, victories of the Revolutionary Wars. But the Battle of Fleurus wasn't really actually a French victory so much as it was the Allies coming to grips with the idea that they weren't going to win out there on that front. The whole offensive at Fleurus stalled for the Allies. And they did what they had done once before. They pulled back. And then surprisingly, kept pulling back. Clearly some decision had been made among the Allied commanders that a quick plunge into Paris wasn't going to happen, and that with the French continuing to simply just mass men from out of nowhere under the levée en masse, bringing guns, this foothold that the Allies had in the Low Countries just was not defendable. And after the Battle of Fleurus, the Allies evacuated Belgium entirely. The Austrian Netherlands. So that territory, which they had pushed France out of, which created panic, they just abandoned it. Leaving it wide open again for French occupation. So not only was there no crisis on the Belgian frontier, the French had just won a stunning victory. And spears? What do you mean, Dustin? So Saint-Just just happened to be there during the Battle of Fleurus, and he rushed back to Paris to personally deliver the fantastic news at the end of June 1794. Not so much, just pretty much a black powder fight up there, Dustin. But Saint-Just rushes back to Paris to deliver the news of this great victory. And it was tactically a great victory. France is left in command of the field and basically all of Belgium at that point. What are you talking about? They're making pole arms and spears. You're not giving me the context to jog my memory on what you're talking about. They started making pole arms or spears. Who's they? I'm not understanding what you're referring to here. This is why chat pops up below me, so that people can understand why I stop at times. That's a problem with chat. Now, no worries. Ask me the question, and I'll clarify it, I think, for everyone next week with what we're talking about here. But I don't want to bog down the flow here because we're almost done. But Saint-Just comes back to Paris after he had personally witnessed the victory at the Battle of Fleurus, and it was... Now, France was definitely not running out of weapons. France was not running out of weapons. They kept stockpiling weapons. They were stockpiling guns at Fleurus along the Belgian front. They were certainly not running out of weapons. That was one of the strategic reasons that the Allies withdrew, was they just kept seeing French men and French guns arrive. So after Fleurus, Saint-Just, seeing it, rushes back to Paris to deliver the news that there's this stunning strategic victory and that the Allies are withdrawing, and then sooner later than that, they withdraw from Belgium entirely. He arrived, but when he got there, he found out that there was not a united capital in Paris ready to celebrate a great victory. Instead, he found everyone holding long knives and staring at everyone else. Far from this being another...
No way!
It's about tree fitting.
Far from this victory being another feather in the cap of the Committee of Public Safety's really impressive record on the turnaround on all of these war fronts. The victory at Fleurus and the retreat of the Allies only bolstered the case coming from the committee's enemies that Robespierre had become a mad tyrant and had no justifiable reason for continuing the terror except to exterminate his personal enemies. Remember, Robespierre had just put all these people on the Paris Commune Assembly. He has just effectively purged the Committee of General Security from relevance. He's created all these enemies who are looking at what these guys are doing and going, why are we killing so many people? What the heck is going on in the Vendée? What's the justification for any of this? And look at what just happened. The biggest allied force that was ever going to be a threat to us is abandoning the Austrian Netherlands. How can you continue to justify what you're doing? And so next episode, Robespierre's enemies are going to strike at him before he can get to them. And they will bring Act 1 of the French Revolution to a final, bloody close. It can be said that the now looming Thermidorian reaction is the end of the French Revolution, and that what comes after it is a second revolution. But still, we have to connect all this to Emperor Napoleon I. So we'll keep on trucking to see what comes after. There is no Committee of Public Safety anymore. Hopefully you've enjoyed tonight's episode. Next week, for sure, is Thermidor. There's no other way narratively around it. That is where we're going. But imagine that last statement for a while. You've gotten very used to the idea of the Committee of Public Safety for a while now. After next week, there will be no Committee of Public Safety. We're going to do our quiz as we always do at the end of the show. Exclamation point answer, space, and then your answer will get you written into the answer file. Do not use the term boy or fix with 2 X's. Otherwise, it'll trigger a different command and not work. Highly encourage everyone here who's enjoyed tonight and paid attention to participate. Let us know that you are enjoying what's going on here. And there's no penalty for getting it wrong, except our opportunity to maybe clarify something that we didn't explain well enough here tonight. So, yeah, give it a shot. Have fun. You're welcome, as always. All can participate. Here we go with the quiz. Whoa, frame rate. Alrighty, here's this week's first question. You get 1 minute on the clock after I finish reading the question. Again, it's exclamation point answer, space, and your answer. Do not use the word boy or fix with 2 X's. Here we go. What is the exact name of the transformative speech given by Robespierre on February 4th, 1794? The exact name. Gilly's in. Dang it. Dustin, if you're on mobile, answer after the buzzer. I'll still take it. Again, the timer's more to keep things moving on a tempo. It's not like a hard, fast rule for us here. Give it a shot. 14 seconds left. What is the exact name of the transformative speech given by Robespierre on February 4th, 1794? We're going to find out here in a second. The correct answer is, quote, Report on the Principles of Public Morality. Gilly says, Report on Public Morality. That is not the exact name. And I don't think anybody else answered. Nope. All right, no one gets question number 1. We're off to a fantastic start. The second question is less exacting and specific. I straight up had no idea. That's fine. What is the fundamental difference in Robespierre's view on the base nature of people as opposed to Machiavelli? It's a philosophy question, class, because this stuff matters. What is the fundamental difference in Robespierre's view on the base nature of people as opposed to Machiavelli? If you've never read The Prince, go get a copy by Machiavelli. I consider The Prince and Plato's Republic to be probably the two most important philosophical texts in history. And The Matrix, I would argue, is based on the Republic. Terry's in, Gilly's in, Arky is in with 10 seconds left. All right, the first answer is from Turi. Robespierre believed people were virtuous by nature. Machiavelli believed they were more cruel by nature. That's fair. My answer is this. Robespierre believed that people are at their base virtuous, good, as individuals. Machiavelli believed the individual to be one who would take advantage of any situation in the absence of rules and consequences. Basically, Machiavelli believes that a person will revert to the common sense term anarchy when given the opportunity. Turi gets it. Next response comes from Gilly. Robespierre believes people were virtuous by default without an external influence to corrupt them. Machiavelli believes people were self-serving without the presence of external oversight or consequence. That's exactly the correct answer. Very good. Arky, he thought people were virtuous rather than sinful. Yes. The next question, I believe we have... That was it, right? Oh, Dustin! He thought people were virtuous, and the opposite is that people are inherently selfish and self-serving. That is correct. Dustin got it. Dustin, who's finally able to hang out for the quiz for the first time in a long time, gets back on the board with 2 points after being knocked off last week. The next question. Describe the basic function of the Committee of General Security in the spring of 1794. Describe the basic function of the Committee of General Security in the spring of 1794. Gilly is in. Arky at 22. Well done, sir. 20 seconds left. Describe the basic function of the Committee of General Security in the spring of 1794. Who'da thunk it? Me. Gilly is the only one who answers. You planning on reset the board to determine during reactions? Probably not a bad idea. Call it season 3. And pick a piece of swag from the store. So after next week, whenever things kind of get hit on the reset button, it's probably a good call. All right, first answer. I think it's the only answer. Gilly. They were in charge of domestic policing and finding counter-revolutionaries. That's the correct answer. No worries. The next question. As Robespierre's paranoia increased, what was the primary detrimental effect of his increasing grip on power? I'm actually interested in the answer to this one because I left it vague kind of on purpose. As Robespierre's paranoia increased, what was the primary detrimental effect of his increasing grip on power? Apart from murder. And I can hear the backspace keys being pressed. Dustin's in. Dustin, Gilly, Rocket all in with answers that all make sense. 5 seconds to go. First answer comes from Dustin, I believe. He built a massive group of enemies. That is correct. My answer is he was creating his own enemies everywhere who were becoming afraid they would be next on the guillotine scaffold. Dustin gets it. Next answer comes from, I believe, Gilly. Robespierre's actions to eliminate his enemies of virtue actually wound up making enemies against him. It became self-fulfilling prophecy of paranoia. Yeah, he actually creates the conspiracy against him, too. That will eventually be the thing that
Remember
gets him.
to clonk that follow button.
Rocket says he's creating factions and enemies. Yep. I can only type things correctly. There we go. The next question. This will be interesting to see answers to. What was the purpose of the cult of the Supreme Being in Robespierre's view? Apart from making him Jacobin Moses. Don't get to say that phrase often in your life. What was the purpose of the cult of What was the purpose of the cult of the Supreme Being in Robespierre's view? 30 seconds. Gilly is in. Psy is in. Let's try to stay away from those joke answers. Even though I didn't say it at the top of this quiz. It's a funny answer. Let's just not make it the norm is all. Man, the programming on this quiz is slick. Have you not seen the new quiz, Dustin? Have you not been able to hang out for this since we redid it? Alright. First answer. Gilly. He wanted to follow the cult of reason up with a new cult which could bridge the divide between old superstition and new rationalism of the Enlightenment. Word for word what I said. To bridge the divide between old superstition and the new rationalism of the Enlightenment is my answer. Psy's answer, I believe, is next. OnlyFans. That is not the answer. Next question. Wow, that's not a word. There we go. That's how I spell that word. During the festival of the Supreme Being in Paris, what was being symbolically destroyed and what was replacing it? It is funny. That's why I said it was funny. It made me laugh. "25 seconds left. During the festival of the Supreme Being in Paris, what was being symbolically destroyed and what was replacing it?" But how do you know the decision didn't ultimately lead to the creation of said platform? I can't disprove that because I haven't researched it, Si. Time is up. Let's see who answers first. What's funny, Dustin, is the whole thing functions off of two commands. The answer command starts everything off, or the question command starts everything off. The answer command is what you guys write to the end of the file. Everything else is just cleaned out in the background via the next question, and then the question command again. I have a button here that I press to bring up everything, and we're all good. Gilly, an effigy of atheism was destroyed, and a statue of wisdom was underneath. Yes, so atheism was being destroyed by wisdom. That is the intended Jacques-Louis David party night effect of that. We should probably have t-shirts at some point that say Jacques-Louis David French Revolution theme night. Just saying that's probably an idea I should pursue for a t-shirt at this point. Gilly gets it. Next answer. Monarchy being replaced by republic. No, that is not correct. Atheism being replaced by wisdom. But good stab. Monarchy being replaced by republic would have been a festival following the insurrection of August the 10th. That is the end of the answers, and that's the last cross-off I see on my list. So we'll go to one that has lots of answers. What was the direct effect of the Law of 22 Prairial? This could be 4 paragraphs long, by the way. Don't make it that long. Nibble in the ballpark, you'll be good. Because it had like 10,000 effects. It's infamous in history as the end of liberty, actually. The end of liberty, not a sufficient enough answer. 30 seconds left. What's the direct effect of the Law of 22 Prairial? Terry nails one of the effects. Gilly. That is the broader effect, yes. 5 seconds left. Dustin gets in as well. That is also an effect. So, I'm going to read off my answer. It made it virtually impossible to defend yourself in the tribunal by stripping one's rights to counsel and the right to call witnesses. It also introduced new crimes, which made slandering patriotism, spreading false news, and seeking to inspire disagreement execution worthy. It also made denouncing each other's crimes mandatory. All trials had 2 outcomes, acquittal or execution. That is also 1. Gilly, Great Terror would begin, and without the... Yep, it did kick off the Great Terror, and without the ability to have counsel and call witnesses, deaths would ramp up sharply, leading to the deaths of 2,600 official victims. Yes, in Paris. Broader death count's much higher than that. This day and age, spreading false news should be a crime, in my opinion. I believe that if you are claiming the label of journalism, then you have an obligation to double verify the information that you are providing and that it be true. I believe that is true. I mean, people are entitled to an opinion, and disinformation is a thing. But if you are broadcasting or publishing or printing or speaking under the label journalism, I believe you have that obligation. And I believe Edward R. Murrow has rolled over in his grave 50,000 times since he died. Yeah, if you say you are a news channel, you must have an external verification you're reporting the truth. I agree with all of those sentiments. If you are saying what you are talking about is news, journalistic news, you definitely have that requirement. Dustin, no more witnesses could be called. That is also an effect of... No, it's not that no more witnesses could be called. No more witnesses could be called by the defendant, but I know where you're coming from. All right, the next question. Why is the Great Terror likely the thing that undoes Robespierre? Two questions left after this one. Why is the Great Terror likely the thing that undoes Robespierre? $30 seconds. Why is the Great Terror likely the thing that undoes Robespierre? Gilly's in with a paragraph. Dustin is in. Arky is in. All very good. The first answer. Gilly, France had no foreign threats or internal threats at the time, so it only bolstered the Committee of General Security's case that the only purpose of the Great Terror was to exterminate personal enemies of Robespierre's. I would say that the case being made wasn't being made only by the Committee of General Security. It was being made by that whole cabal of returning representatives and Danton's allies, as well as the people on the Paris Commune Assembly who are like, ooh, this is just going to keep happening. But, yes. Dustin, he overstepped his power and there was no more reason for defense since France was dominating everywhere. Yes, there was no more reason to have the terror in place, as all of the reasons for it didn't exist anymore. All right. Next answer. Arky, because by this time most people felt it was unnecessary. Very, very, very clean statement on it. Most people felt that the terror itself had become unnecessary, so why the heck was it ramping up? The next question, 2 more to go. Putting aside the brutality of the infernal columns, what made it a viable military strategy? Uncomfortable question time. Putting aside the brutality of the infernal columns, what made it a viable military strategy? 30 seconds left. Turi's in. Gilly's in. 10 seconds. Time is up. All right, first from Turi. There was no concern in differentiating a military target versus civilian. Yes, basically guerrilla war had broken out, and it's impossible in a guerrilla war to differentiate between combatant and civilian. I would say that kids don't fall into that. But yes, the idea being that if you're fighting in a regular force, that scorched earth becomes a common military strategy for a guerrilla war, simply because there are no installations, there are no organized and formal armies to fight, and so that makes it a viable strategy militarily. I wouldn't say morally. The next answer. Gilly. There are very little ability to distinguish civilian from combatant, and this would basically eliminate every possible threat, not just the ones that were known. Yep. Anybody else answer? No. Gilly was the last one. Last question. It is not an opinion question for the first time in several episodes. With the French armies already strong due to the levée en masse and the amalgame, what did Louis Saint-Just do to improve it further in 1794? $40 seconds. With the French armies already strong due to the levée en masse and the amalgame, what did Louis de Saint-Just do to improve it further in 1794? Turi is in. Gilly is in. Yeah, you can say a lot of things about him. He's a weasel for sure. Boy, was he committed. Time is up with 2 people answering. Turi's answer first. Visited the war front, specifically the Army of the North and Army of the Rhine, and eliminated problematic commanders to boost morale. Yeah, wherever he went, the dude went to work. That is for sure. That is correct. That's a good answer, Turi. Don't know, dang it, I gotta go too. Thanks for a great show. You're welcome, Dustin. Thanks for hanging out. I'm glad you were able to hang out for the whole show this week. And if I don't talk to you before then, I'll see you hopefully Monday morning. The last answer of the night comes from Gilly. He installed stricter discipline, yes. A sense of purpose, yes. And replaced crappy leadership, yes. Sometimes murderously, yes. With effective leadership, yes. Especially Lazar Hoche. Don't forget that name. And let's rock back over to the main screen here. As always, thank you all for hanging out tonight. I truly appreciate it. Hopefully you are all enjoying our continuing adventures through the French Revolution. Our familiar footing will not last past next episode. On the work front, I've only got 2 reviews left and 2 weeks to do them all in. And I'm pretty confident that I've got the pace figured out now, so we should be on track. I feel like there's another 12 to 15 episodes left in the French Revolution before we take a break around the year mark and let me kind of get re-geared up for Napoleon proper, which will be shorter. And yeah, so let's get out of here. Let's get you guys going. We're going to go raid Fable 42 again. I know some of you don't like the fact that they are follower only, but they run a good show for D&D. And they're only one of my 2 options tonight to raid, and I enjoy hanging out there. They're good people, and they support veterans, and so that's always going to be a soft spot for me, so we'll go hang out there. Consider dropping them a follow, but we'll do our normal stuff on the way out of here. Dustin, Monday through Friday, 7:30 to 10:30 a.m. I think he's getting back into Horizon Zero Dawn's DLC in advance of Forbidden West coming out on Monday. Turi, thanks for being here as well. Permanoob's after him at 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. I think he's still going with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, though I have missed the past few streams there. Gilly will be up tomorrow night, Sunday night, 6 p.m. Eastern Time, still going with Dragon Age Inquisition. And then our good friend Rocket was streaming this morning, LA Noire. Catch your Tuesdays, Thursdays, other days during the week as well, and then Saturday mornings. And as always, make sure you go follow our friend CF Live, who has worked so hard on our music for the show. And our other great friend, Mr. Landiggity, who worked with CF on the intro music, is a great all-around dude. He's going to marry Fish, and we'll play games with his friends on stream. I'm out of here. I'll talk to you later. Have a great weekend, and I love you all.
Be excellent to each other.